17-year-old Madison sits in the front pew of First Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, the same pew her grandmother sat in for 60 years. The choir is singing, the pastor is preaching fire and brimstone, and Madison is scrolling through TikTok with her phone hidden behind her Bible. By the time the service ends, she's made a decision she's been wrestling with for months. She will never come back. And she's not alone, not even close. Across the American South, something extraordinary is happening. The Bible Belt, that sprawling region stretching from Texas to Virginia where church attendance has been as certain as sweet tea at Sunday dinner, is experiencing an exodus. But these aren't elderly members passing away or middle-aged folks drifting off. These are teenagers. These are the children who were supposed to carry the torch, the generation that was baptized, confirmed, and youth grouped into the faith. And they're leaving in numbers that have sent shockwaves through America's religious establishment. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shape our world. Before we go further into this cultural earthquake happening right under our noses, I have to ask, where are you watching this from? Are you in the Bible Belt yourself? Are you someone who left the church or someone who stayed? Drop your location and your story in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your experience with this phenomenon. In 2008, 72% of teenagers in the South identified as Christian. By 2023, that number had plummeted to just 48%. Let that sink in. In 15 years, nearly a quarter of an entire generation walked away. But the raw numbers don't tell the whole story. When you break down the data, something even more dramatic emerges. While some of those young people simply became less religious, the majority didn't just drift into spiritual ambiguity. They actively rejected organized religion altogether. Sarah Williams was 16 when she told her parents she wouldn't be attending Eastside Community Church in Nashville anymore. Her father, a deacon, was devastated. Her mother cried for 3 days. But Sarah had watched the church she grew up in transform from a place of community into what she called a political rally with Jesus stickers. During the 2020 election, her youth pastor spent more time talking about voting than about the Gospels. When she asked why the church seemed more concerned with who people loved than with helping the homeless population growing just blocks away, she was told she was being rebellious. She was told to pray about it. She was told young people today don't understand respect. Sarah's story isn't unique. It's being repeated in thousands of variations across every state from Oklahoma to the Carolinas. But to understand why this is happening, we need to understand what the Bible Belt actually is, and more importantly, what it meant for the young people growing up inside it. The term Bible Belt was coined in 1924 by journalist H. L. Mencken, who used it mockingly to describe the regions of America where evangelical Protestantism held tremendous cultural and political power. Throughout most of the 20th century, this wasn't just about religion. It was about identity. To be Southern often meant to be Christian. Church wasn't just where you worshiped, it was where you networked, where you found your spouse, where your kids made friends, where your reputation was built or destroyed. Missing church was like missing Thanksgiving dinner. It just wasn't done. For generations, this system worked. Children were born into church communities, raised in them, married in them, and eventually brought their own children. The cycle seemed unbreakable. Churches grew larger, more influential, more embedded into the fabric of Southern life. By the 1980s and 1990s, megachurches sprouted across the landscape like kudzu, some boasting congregations of 10,000 or more. These weren't your grandmother's churches with modest wooden pews. These were entertainment complexes with rock bands, light shows, coffee bars, and bookstores. And then came Generation Z. Born roughly between 1997 and 2012, Gen Z is the first generation to grow up with the internet from birth, the first to have smartphones in middle school, the first to see the world not through the lens of their local community, but through the infinite perspectives of social media. And this changed everything. Jaden Cooper, now 19, grew up in a conservative evangelical church in Arkansas. He remembers being 12 years old and hearing his pastor explain that evolution was a lie designed to turn people away from God. But Jaden had already watched dozens of science videos on YouTube. He'd seen the evidence, read the explanations, understood the mechanisms. He raised his hand and asked a question about fossil records. The pastor dismissed it. When Jaden persisted, citing specific examples, he was told that he was letting Satan plant doubts in his mind. That moment, Jaden later said, was when he realized the adults in his life would rather defend their beliefs than engage with reality. This collision between traditional religious teaching and empirical evidence available at young people's fingertips has created a crisis of credibility. According to a 2022 study by the Pew Research Center, 63% of young people who left religion cited scientific contradictions as a major factor. But it wasn't just evolution. It was the age of the Earth being taught as 6,000 years when geology said 4.5 billion. It was global flood myths when geology told a different story. It was being told that prayer could heal diseases when medical science demonstrated otherwise. But science was just the beginning. Perhaps no issue has driven more young people from Southern churches than LGBTQ rights. In 2012, when Barack Obama became the first sitting president to support same-sex marriage, evangelical churches across the South mobilized in opposition. Pastors preached sermons about the sanctity of traditional marriage. Youth groups were taught that homosexuality was a sin, a choice, something to be prayed away. And for a while, many teenagers in these communities believed what they were told. Then they met Jake, or Emma, or their cousin Marcus, or their best friend since elementary school. They watched people they loved, people they knew were kind and genuine, people who laughed at the same jokes and cried at the same movies, be told they were abominations. They watched as churches that preached love and acceptance drew a hard line at sexual orientation. And they watched as some of those people, unable to reconcile their faith with their identity, took their own lives. In 2019, Tyler Clementi's story became a rallying cry. Though he wasn't from the Bible Belt, his suicide after being outed as gay resonated deeply with young people across the South who saw similar dynamics in their own communities. Youth groups that once had waiting lists began to empty. Instagram posts appeared, "I can't worship at a place that wouldn't let my best friend through the door." The statistics on this are stark. According to a 2021 survey by the Public Religion Research Institute, 79% of Gen Z Americans supported same-sex marriage, compared to just 41% of the silent generation. But in Bible Belt churches, the official doctrine hadn't budged. The disconnect became unbridgeable. Amanda Rodriguez attended a mega church in Texas with her family every Sunday and Wednesday. She sang in the praise band. She went on mission trips. She believed deeply in her faith. But when her youth group leader started a series on biblical sexuality, teaching that gay people could be fixed through prayer and counseling, Amanda felt something break inside her. Her brother had come out to her the year before. She knew he wasn't broken. She knew he didn't need fixing. She confronted her youth leader, asking how a loving God could create people just to condemn them. The answer was theological jargon that boiled down to, "Don't question too much." Amanda stopped attending. When her parents demanded an explanation, she told them she couldn't worship a God who hated her brother. Her parents insisted the church didn't teach hate, just biblical truth. But Amanda had seen the effect that biblical truth had on her brother's mental health, and she wanted no part of it. Now, here's something fascinating that often gets overlooked in these discussions. While we're talking about young people leaving churches, we need to acknowledge that not all churches in the Bible Belt are the same. There are progressive congregations, affirming churches, places that have tried to evolve with the times. But here's the problem. They're massively outnumbered, and in many communities they face tremendous backlash. A Methodist church in Mississippi that hung a rainbow flag in 2018 had its windows smashed and received death threats. Young people who might have stayed for a more progressive version of Christianity often don't have that option available to them. But we need to talk about the elephant in the room, actually the elephant wearing a red hat. Since 2016, the fusion of evangelical Christianity and partisan politics has accelerated at a pace that has left many young people whiplashed. 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016, a statistic that shocked many young churchgoers who had been taught that character matters, that honesty matters, that how you treat others matters. When they pointed out contradictions between Trump's behavior and the values they'd been taught in church, they were told they didn't understand the big picture. They were told to focus on the Supreme Court, on abortion, on religious liberty. Marcus Thompson was 14 in 2016. He remembers his youth pastor showing campaign videos during youth group. He remembers sermons that were thinly veiled political speeches. He remembers his Sunday school teacher telling the class that Democrats were literally evil. When Marcus, who had started thinking critically about complex issues, tried to discuss poverty programs or immigration reform from a Christian perspective, he was shut down. Christianity, it seemed, had become synonymous with a specific political ideology. The numbers here are impossible to ignore. A 2023 survey found that 44% of young people who left evangelical churches cited hypocrisy around politics as either the primary or contributing factor. They watched churches that had spent decades preaching sexual purity rally behind a thrice-married candidate who bragged about sexual assault. They watched churches that preached compassion support policies separating families at the border. They watched churches that taught humility embrace the most bombastic rhetoric imaginable. For many, the cognitive dissonance became too much. By the way, if you're finding this deep dive valuable, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue making these detailed documentaries. But no pressure. Let's keep going. Then came the scandals. Oh, the scandals. Every few months, it seemed, another megachurch pastor was exposed. Embezzlement, sexual abuse, affairs. The stories became grimly predictable. A charismatic leader with a massive following and minimal accountability would be revealed to have been living a double life, sometimes for years, sometimes with the knowledge of church leadership who covered it up. In 2021, an investigation revealed that the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in America, with a massive presence across the Bible Belt, had covered up sexual abuse allegations for decades. The report detailed hundreds of cases where leaders knew about abuse and did nothing, or worse, actively protected abusers. For young people who had grown up being told that the church was the moral authority, that secular society was corrupt while the church was pure, this was devastating. Bethany Ramirez was 17 when the revelations about her former church surfaced. A youth leader she had trusted, who had counseled dozens of teenagers, had been quietly relocated to another state after multiple girls reported inappropriate behavior. The church had known. They had paid settlements. They had said nothing. Bethany learned all this not from church leadership coming clean, but from a news article. She deleted her church's app that night and never went back. What amplified all of these issues was social media. Previous generations who had doubts might have felt isolated, like something was wrong with them. But today's teenagers can find thousands of others with similar experiences instantly. Reddit threads like X-Evangelical have hundreds of thousands of members sharing their stories, validating each other's experiences, processing collective trauma. TikTok videos with the hashtag #JustXvangelical have been viewed over 300 million times. Young people aren't leaving in isolation anymore. They're leaving together, supporting each other, building new communities outside the church walls. But here's where the story gets even more complex. Because while all of this was happening, many churches doubled down. Instead of self-reflection, instead of acknowledging problems, many responded by blaming the young people themselves. They were called immature, deceived, rebellious. They were told they'd been corrupted by liberal colleges, despite many of them still being in high school. They were warned about hell, about losing their way, about breaking their parents' hearts. This response only accelerated the exodus. Jessica Nguyen attended Cornerstone Church in Atlanta with her Vietnamese immigrant parents. When she stopped attending at 16, her parents brought in the pastor for an intervention. Instead of listening to her concerns about the church's treatment of LGBT members and its political rhetoric, The pastor spent 2 hours telling her she was in a spiritual battle, that Satan was using her pride against her. Jessica sat quietly, nodded, and then simply stopped engaging. She learned to lie about where she was on Sunday mornings. She became, in her words, a church refugee hiding in plain sight. The economic dimension of this shift can't be ignored either. Gen Z came of age watching their millennial siblings graduate into the worst job market since the Great Depression. They watched student debt balloon to crisis levels. They saw their parents struggle through the 2008 recession and then COVID. And they watched churches build bigger parking lots, fancier sound systems, and million-dollar salaries for senior pastors while people in their communities went hungry. When they asked why the church wasn't selling some assets to help the poor, they were told they didn't understand how things worked. When they questioned why their youth pastor drove a BMW while preaching about Jesus, who had nowhere to lay his head, they were told they were being judgmental. The disconnect between the message and the messenger became impossible to ignore. What profession do you have, by the way? Are you a teacher seeing this happen with your students? A pastor watching your youth group shrink? A parent navigating this with your own kids? Your perspective matters. Share it below. Now, the response from churches has been varied. Some have genuinely tried to adapt. They've hired younger pastors, updated their music, added coffee bars and Instagram-worthy aesthetics. But what many discovered is that young people weren't leaving over style issues. They were leaving over substance. A fog machine and a hip pastor wearing skinny jeans couldn't overcome fundamental disagreements about science, human rights, and integrity. Other churches have taken a different approach: alarm and catastrophizing. Conferences on keeping your teens in church have become a cottage industry. Books with titles like Don't Let Them Go and Winning the Battle for Your Kids' Faith sell thousands of copies. But often the advice boils down to more control, more indoctrination, more fear-based messaging, which, ironically, tends to drive even more young people away. There's a fascinating psychological element here. Research on religious deconversion shows that it's rarely one big event. Instead, it's usually a series of small cracks that accumulate until the foundation crumbles. A contradiction here, a hypocrisy there, a question dismissed, a value violated. For many young people in the Bible Belt, their deconversion story sounds like death by 1,000 cuts. But we need to address something important. Not all young people are leaving because they've become secular or atheist. Many are spiritual but not religious. They still believe in God, still pray, still read the Bible. They've just separated their faith from institutional religion. They create their own practices, their own communities, their own relationship with the divine, unmediated by pastors and buildings and organizational hierarchies. This actually terrifies institutional churches more than outright atheism. Because an atheist might come back to faith someday, but someone who has faith without the church, they don't need to come back. They've found another way. The demographic impact of this shift is only beginning to be understood. Churches that were built on the assumption of generational continuity are suddenly facing an uncertain future. Buildings that held 1,000 worshipers 30 years ago now struggle to fill 200 seats. Small-town churches that anchored communities for a century are closing. The social infrastructure of the Bible Belt is fundamentally changing. And it's not just attendance. It's money. Churches in America are funded primarily through tithes and offerings. When an entire generation stops attending, the financial model collapses. We're already seeing the effects. Between 2010 and 2020, over 4,000 Protestant churches closed in America, with the highest concentration in the South. Financial struggles lead to cut programs, which leads to fewer people attending, which leads to worse finances. It's a death spiral that church consultants call the doom loop. Some communities are trying to adapt. In Memphis, a coalition of churches sold several properties and combined resources to create a community center focused on actual service rather than Sunday worship. They provide job training, addiction counseling, food banks, after-school programs. And interestingly, some young people who had left evangelical churches started volunteering, not attending services, but serving. Because for many of them, the message of Jesus about helping the poor and loving your neighbor still resonated. They just couldn't stomach the institutional baggage that came with it. But in many places, the response has been defensive. Pastors preach sermons about persecution, about how the world hates Christians, about how staying true to the faith means standing firm against cultural pressure. And every time they frame it this way, more young people check out. Because from their perspective, they're not attacking Christianity. They're rejecting hypocrisy, exclusion, and dishonesty. There's a particular tragedy in watching parents and children break apart over this issue. Families who ate dinner together every night, who took vacations together, who genuinely loved each other, now can barely talk because church has become such a wedge issue. Parents feel like their children's very souls are at stake. Children feel like their parents are choosing an institution over them. Both sides are hurting, both sides feel betrayed. And the church, which should theoretically be about reconciliation and peace, often makes it worse by forcing ultimatums. We've seen families split because a grandmother wrote a grandchild out of her will for leaving the church. We've seen parents threaten to cut off college funding if their kid doesn't attend services. We've seen teenagers kicked out of their homes for asking the wrong questions. The irony, in many ways, is profound. Churches that spent decades warning about secular persecution are now creating persecution from within. They're proving true something Jesus said in the Gospels: "By their fruits you will know them." And young people are looking at the fruits and finding them bitter. What about the future? Where does this trend lead? Demographically, the South is becoming less uniformly Christian every year. The Bible Belt is fraying. Within a generation, it may not exist as we've known it. This will have enormous political implications, cultural implications, and social implications we're only beginning to understand. Some churches will evolve. They'll become more inclusive, more honest, more focused on service than doctrine. They'll acknowledge past harms and work toward repair. These churches might survive, even thrive. Others will refuse to change, will circle the wagons, will become smaller and more insular. They'll essentially become countercultural enclaves, which is a strange position for institutions that held cultural dominance for so long. And the young people? They're building something new. New communities, new ethics, new ways of finding meaning and connection. Some are rediscovering ancient Christian practices stripped of evangelical baggage. Others are exploring entirely different spiritual traditions. Many are finding community in shared interests, activism, mutual aid networks. Catherine Mills, who left her church in North Carolina at 15, now runs a community garden that feeds homeless folks in her city. She says she's living out Jesus' teachings more now than she ever did when she was in church. She doesn't call herself a Christian anymore, but she embodies what she believes Christianity should have been about all along. She's not alone in this. Across the South, we're seeing young people create networks of care and support that look suspiciously like what church was supposed to be, just without the church. The story of teens leaving the Bible Belt churches isn't just about religion. It's about authenticity in a world of performance. It's about integrity in a time of hypocrisy. It's about young people who were promised one thing and delivered another, finally saying enough. It's about the collision between authority and information, between tradition and evolution, between what we've always done and what actually makes sense. Madison, the girl we met at the beginning sitting in that Birmingham pew, is now 19. She's studying environmental science at university. She says she still believes in God, just not the God she was taught about. She believes in the Jesus who hung out with outcasts and challenged religious authorities, not the Jesus whose name was used to justify cruelty and exclusion. She hasn't been to church in 2 years and she doesn't plan to go back, but she volunteers at a refugee center every week. She says that's her church now, the actual people, the actual service, the actual love. Without the building, without the institution, without the rules that seemed more about control than compassion. And when you look at what's happening across the Bible Belt, Madison's story isn't the exception. It's becoming the rule. A generation of young people are walking away from churches and towards something else. Whether that something else fills the void religion once occupied, whether it provides the community and meaning humans seem to need, whether it leads somewhere better or just somewhere different, Well, that's a documentary for another day. Thanks for watching Professor Archive. If this deep dive made you think, hit that like button and share your story in the comments. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads.